Hi, I'm Kathleen Carroll of the Yale University Department of Psychiatry at the School of Medicine, and this section is going to be about the NIH stage model of behavioral therapies development. This model came about in the early 2000s, and what it did was, using a technology model, talk about three distinct stages of science that are relevant to developing, testing, and disseminating behavioral therapies. These are more or similar to the phase model of pharmacotherapy development, but there are important differences along the way, which I'll try to highlight. In stage one is really pilot work. In this stage, you're just putting a new therapy together, attempting to demonstrate feasibility and promise, developing manuals, training materials, and so forth. Stage two are really randomized controlled trials. They're meant to demonstrate the efficacy of the treatment compared with something else, a control or comparison approach. Also, and it's very important to think about mechanisms, what makes that treatment actually effective or not, and identify important mediators and moderators. And in the next stage, typically after at least 2 randomized clinical trials have demonstrated the efficacy of a given approach, then you look into stage 3, which is looking at applicability, generalizable, and effectiveness in the real world. I'll come back to that later because it's a lot more complicated than it sounds. One important thing to understand about the stage model is that it never was and never will be linear. It doesn't. No treatment really goes smoothly from stage 1 to stage 2 to stage 3. Typically, as we get a treatment up and going, we find there are all kinds of complications and barriers to getting it into the real world. And in the next section, I'll talk a little bit about how we've dealt with some of those barriers. And basically, once you do dissemination, often you have to go back to the drawing board at stage 1. So it's a heuristic model, it's a self-correcting model, and it's anything but linear. What the stage model did, though, and it started at NIDA and then went to NIAAA, was that it provided a new way of thinking about how to develop and evaluate behavioral therapies. It provided a model for rapid and systematic development of promising treatments from good ideas to something that could be tested. So again, as we said in the previous research lecture on the technology model, to get a new treatment evaluated, you already had to be pretty far along. You had to have manuals, some indication of promise, ways to train therapists, and so forth. And so the stage model became a way to get grant funding to do these small studies that enable new treatments and new ideas to enter the field. And again, it emphasized the need for not declaring victory after 1 or 2 clinical trials, but again, to think about how a therapy could be translated and adopted in the real world. Would clinicians use it? Would payers pay for it? And so forth. Now, returning to what a stage 1 study was, and in current parlance, this would be like an R34 type study, which NIH does support. If you're going to get ready to do a stage 2 clinical trial, stage 1 should provide what you need for that. And so the products of stage 1 should be a fully developed treatment manual for both your new experimental treatment as well as the control approach, which is really very important. Some strategies for training of clinicians, the training program, what are the standards that are required for a clinician to be certified to deliver the treatment in the protocol, and so forth, and ideally some demonstration of the feasibility of the treatment. It can be implemented, patients will complete it, and so forth, and some evidence of its promise with respect to some control condition, again emphasizing mechanism. And in fact, it is now possible to do stage 1 studies across NIH. Generally, these are 30, usually there's about 3-year trials rather. Phase 1 includes manual development, where it's tested out through small groups, drafting the process assessments, and so forth. Phase 2 is usually devoted to therapist training, and in Phase 3, which takes a little bit longer, it's a small randomized pilot trial emphasizing feasibility and getting some sort of promise of potential effect size. Now, moving to Stage 2, we really want to think far beyond just simple horse race studies. Is this treatment better than that? Stage 2 is really about a much richer set of questions, looking at mediators and moderators in response to the treatment, understanding things like dose-effect relationships. What's the minimal level of exposure to this treatment that's required to exert an effect? We can think about sequenced or stepped approaches, adaptive designs, smart designs, and so forth, or combined treatments. Again, the emphasis should always be on mechanism and developing the most potent form of the treatment that we possibly can. However, as we found now, and in fact, most funded research is Stage 1 or Stage 2 in behavioral therapies. It's much more complicated when you get out to the real world. And there are all kinds of strategies or challenges for dissemination. And what we find when we're trying to implement a treatment in a community program is not a lot of excitement about how effective this new treatment is. We get questions about how much it costs. That's fine, Dr. Carroll, this beautiful individual treatment, but we only do groups, and we don't have time. We can only do it in 5 minutes. So these are things that we call sort of the implementation cliff. And there are all kinds of things associated with what happens to good treatments that don't wind up in the clinical world, things like the cost of training and clinician turnover, limited availability of trained clinicians, and so forth. So that's really led for some rethinking of the stage model. This was a project led by Lisa Onken of NIH. And it basically, while the top part there in the red circle really talks about the emphasis that new treatments should be based in basic science. It's stage 0 and Stage 2. It really emphasizes the need for almost a new set of scientific approaches as we think about how do you move the most potent version of a given therapy into the clinical world. How do you move it into clinical and community programs? How do you think about sustainability? How do you think about effectiveness and so forth? So what I'd like to do in the next talk is talk about a specific treatment, cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT, and how we've worked it through the stage model. So over the last 20 years, we've pretty much gotten CBT through the early part of the stage model. We manualized it. We developed all kinds of ways of training clinicians to use it effectively. And Stage 2 and 3 work has demonstrated that it's effective. It appears to be more or less fairly durable. People seem to learn the skills and get benefit from the treatment long after they leave treatment. We've done all kinds of training and dissemination studies, but we also found it's a great treatment that's really not there in the real world. Again, tons of challenges to dissemination. The training time, the complexity of CBT, we find in the real world, as I talked about in the technology model lecture, fidelity to treatment guidelines is just awful in the real world. There's basically no system for performance monitoring and feedback in clinical practice. And what we have still is a field where people do what's inexpensive and easy and reimbursed, frankly. And there's very little movement of empirically validated therapies into the clinical world. What we found after 20 years of work is that we had our lovely manualized CBT delivered for clinicians who work hard and mean well, But after listening to all of those tapes, we find that there's very little penetration of CBT into the clinical community, and even in given specific sessions, there's about 5 minutes of actual skills training or CBT work in an average group or individual session. And I'll talk about how we handle that in the next lecture.